In the spring of 323 BC, the city of Babylon was the center of the world. It was a metropolis of brick and bitumen, a labyrinth of canals and ancient temples that had stood for thousands of years before the first Macedonian spear had ever been forged. To this ancient seat of power returned a man who had reshaped the map of the known earth in just a decade. Alexander, son of Philip, king of Macedonia, pharaoh of Egypt, lord of Asia, was 32 years old. He ruled an empire that stretched from the snow-capped mountains of the Balkans to the burning sands of the Punjab. He was unbeaten in battle, worshipped as a living god, and arguably the wealthiest man who had ever lived. Yet, as he approached the great walls of the city, Alexander was not a man triumphant. He was a man haunted. The king who rode towards the Euphrates was physically and spiritually scarred. His body was a roadmap of his conquests, covered in old wounds from swords, arrows, and stones. His lung had been pierced by an arrow in India, a wound that never fully healed and left him with a rasping, weakened breath. But the deeper wounds were invisible. Alexander was in deep, agonizing mourning. Just months earlier, in the city of Ecbatana, his closest companion, his second self, Hephaestion, had died of a sudden fever. The loss had unmoored Alexander. He had crucified the physician who failed to save him, razed the temple of Asclepius, and ordered the manes of the cavalry horses shorn in grief. He had slaughtered a local tribe, the Caucaeans, as a human sacrifice to his friend's ghost. Now, entering Babylon, he carried a grief that was terrifying in its intensity, a black hole that swallowed the joy of his victories. The omens, too, were dark. As the royal procession neared the city, a delegation of Chaldean astronomers, the ancient priests of Babylon who read the will of the heavens in the movement of the stars, came out to meet him. They were terrified. They begged the king not to enter the city. Their charts showed that Bel, the great god of Babylon, was angry. They warned that if Alexander entered the city facing west, looking at the setting sun, he would die. They advised him to circle around and enter from the east, or better yet, to stay away entirely. Alexander, who had once consulted the oracle of Ammon in the breathless silence of the Siwa oasis, now found his patience for prophecy waning. He suspected the priests were merely trying to keep him away to hide their embezzlement of the temple funds. With a flash of the arrogance that had come to define his later years, he quoted the tragedian Euripides, "The best prophet is he who guesses well." He ignored the warning. He turned his horse and rode through the gates into the belly of the beast. But despite the omen, he tried to circle the city to enter from the east. The marshy terrain, flooded by the Euphrates, blocked his path. Frustrated, muddy, and exhausted, he was forced to turn back and enter facing west facing the sunset, just as the priests had feared. The trap was set. Once inside the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air of Babylon in late May was heavy, humid, and thick with mosquitoes rising from the marshes. The palace itself was a city within a city, a sprawling complex of tiled courtyards and hanging gardens that seemed to trap the heat. Here, Alexander threw himself into a frenzy of activity to drown out the silence left by Hephaestion. He was not planning to rest. He was planning the next war. His eyes were set on Arabia. The vast peninsula to the south was rich in spices and reputedly wealthy, a land that had never submitted to a foreign king. Alexander ordered a massive fleet to be assembled. Ships were dismantled in Phoenicia, carried overland to the Euphrates, and reassembled. He envisioned a new coastal capital, a commercial empire that would link India, Egypt, and Babylon. He met with his admirals, Nearchus and Onesicritus, poring over maps, dictating the logistics of water supplies and grain depots. To the outside observer, the Macedonian war machine seemed as vibrant and hungry as ever. But inside the royal circle, the mood was toxic. The court was a viper's nest of paranoia. Alexander's behavior had become increasingly erratic and despotic. He had adopted Persian dress and customs, forcing his proud Macedonian veterans to prostrate themselves before him, a humiliation they deeply resented. He had purged his own ranks, executing loyal generals like Parmenion and killing his friend Cletus the Black in a drunken rage. Now, no one felt safe. The generals Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus circled him warily, like wolves waiting for the alpha to stumble. They were men of immense talent and ambition, trained by decades of war, and they watched their king with a mixture of reverence and dread. Alexander sought refuge in the one place where the ghost couldn't find him, the bottom of a wine cup. The Macedonian court had always been known for its heavy drinking, but in Babylon, the revelry turned into a kind of nihilistic endurance sport. Night after night, the king hosted banquets that lasted until dawn. These were not civilized Greek symposiums with philosophical debate. They were binge-drinking contests where men drank unmixed wine until they passed out or vomited. Alexander, desperate to numb his physical pain and his emotional void, led the way. He drank ferociously, challenging his companions to match him. It was a slow suicide by vintage, a deliberate poisoning of the body that had survived the spears of the Persians and the elephants of the Indians. The heat of the Babylonian summer began to rise, baking the mud brick walls until they radiated heat long into the night. The marsh fever malaria was rampant in the city, carried by the swarms of insects that bred in the stagnant canals. Alexander, weakened by his old wounds, exhausted by his grief, and compromised by alcohol, was the perfect host for the disease. But he felt invincible. He was the son of Zeus. He had crossed the Hindu Kush in winter. He had marched through the Gedrosian desert where birds fell dead from the sky. What was a fever to him? On the increasingly hot days leading up to the invasion, strange incidents began to occur, further rattling the nerves of the army. One day, Alexander left the royal throne to play ball with his companions. When he returned, he found a stranger sitting on his throne, wearing the royal diadem and holding the royal scepter. The man, a Greek prisoner named Dionysius, sat in silence. When questioned, he claimed that the god Serapis had released him from his chains and told him to sit there. The eunuchs and guards, paralyzed by the sight, had done nothing. To the superstitious Greeks and Babylonians, this was a terrifying portent. The throne was waiting for a new occupant. Alexander ordered the man tortured and executed, but the image of the stranger on the throne lingered in the minds of the court. The king was being displaced. As the date of the Arabian invasion approached, fixed for the 20th of the month of Dacius, the frantic energy in the palace reached a crescendo. The harbor was full of triremes conducting drills. The army was camped outside the walls, thousands of men checking their sarissas and polishing their shields, ready for another conquest. But inside the palace, the king was unraveling. He spent his days sacrificing to the gods, to Zeus, to Hercules, to Poseidon, desperate to regain the favor of the heavens. But the heavens were silent. The only sound was the sloshing of wine and the murmurs of the generals in the corridors. On the night of the 16th of Dacius, Alexander held a magnificent feast for Nearchus, his admiral. The party was a farewell celebration before the fleet set sail. The wine flowed freely. The king was in high spirits, perhaps manic, laughing too loud, his face flushed. As the official banquet wound down and the guests began to retire, Alexander rose to go to bed. He bathed, washing off the sweat of the hot night. He was ready to sleep, to rest before the final preparations. But fate, in the form of a man named Medius, was waiting in the hallway. Medius of Larissa was a sycophant, a favorite of the king who knew how to flatter and how to pour. He stopped Alexander and invited him to a private after-party, a comus, that was just getting started in his quarters. "The company is good," Medius promised, "and the wine is excellent." Alexander, unable to face the silence of his own bedchamber, unable to be alone with his thoughts, agreed. He turned away from his rest and walked towards the sound of music and laughter coming from Medius's rooms. He did not know it, but he was walking into his grave. The king of the world had fought his last battle, and he had lost it not to a soldier, but to a cup. The party of Medius of Larissa was not a state affair. It was an escape. In the intimate and closed quarters of the palace, removed from the prying eyes of the Persian nobility and the rigid protocols of the court, the Macedonian inner circle reverted to their oldest traditions. Here, they were not administrators of a global empire. They were soldiers from the rough hills of the north, men who measured their vitality by their capacity to consume. The air was thick with the smoke of oil lamps and the sweet, cloying scent of unmixed wine. Alexander was the center of gravity, reclining on a couch, surrounded by the men who had followed him to the ends of the earth. But the laughter was brittle. The king drank with a desperate intensity, a man trying to outrun a shadow that was already touching his heels. The ancient sources Plutarch, Arrian, Diodorus give us a fragmented but terrifying glimpse of these final hours. They describe a session of drinking that defied human limits. Alexander, having already spent the evening drinking with Nearchus, now began a fresh assault on his senses. He drank to the health of every man present, roughly 20 guests, draining a cup for each. This was the Macedonian custom of the Kamos, a ritualized bender where refusal was an insult. As the night bled into the early morning of the 18th of Decius, the conversation grew slurred, the memories of old battles mixing with the boastful plans for the Arabian conquest. The king spoke of the fleet, of the great harbor he would build, of the gods who favored him. He seemed a force of nature, inexhaustible, but there was a limit. As the sun began to rise over the Euphrates, Alexander called for the cup of Heracles. This was a massive vessel, a skyphos holding 2 chos of wine roughly 6 liters or 12 pints. It was a challenge cup, a feat of strength usually reserved for the start of a contest, not the end of a long night. The room watched as the king lifted the monstrous goblet. He drained it. He paused, perhaps feeling the alcohol flooding his system, and then, in a moment of supreme hubris or fatal thirst, he ordered it filled again. He lifted the cup of Heracles a second time. He began to drink, and then he stopped. The silence that followed was not the silence of awe. It was the silence of horror. Alexander did not finish the wine. He cried out, a sharp, sudden sound that cut through the drunken haze of the room. He clutched at his back, as if he had been struck by a spear. The cup fell from his hand, clattering onto the mosaic floor, the dark red wine spilling like blood. He collapsed back onto his cushion, his face draining of color. The fever had arrived. The immediate reaction was confusion. The guests, intoxicated and bewildered, crowded around. Was it a cramp? Was it the wine? Some would later whisper of poison, of a cup spiked with white hellebore or strychnine, administered by a vengeful cupbearer or a conspiring general. They would point fingers at Iollas, the cupbearer, or Cassander, the son of the disgraced Antipater. But in that moment, there was no talk of murder, only the terrifying sight of the invincible king writhing in agony. Medius and his attendants carried Alexander out of the hall. The party was over. The music stopped. The guests stumbled out into the dawn light of Babylon, sobering up with the sickening realization that the world had just shifted on its axis. Alexander was taken to the bathhouse, his preferred sanctuary. He bathed, shivering now, trying to wash away the pain that was radiating through his chest and back. He was put to bed in the cool, tiled rooms of the royal apartments. The physicians were summoned. They arrived with their potions and poultices, their faces grave. They were accustomed to treating sword cuts and arrow wounds, the bloody arithmetic of war. But this was different. This was a fire from within. For the rest of that day, the 18th of Decius, Alexander slept fitfully. The fever was high, but not yet catastrophic. When he woke, he was weak but lucid. He refused to cancel his schedule. This was the man who had marched with a punctured lung. He would not be stopped by a headache. He played dice with Medius. He issued orders to his officers. He commanded that the infantry be ready to march in 4 days, and the fleet to sail in 5. He was in denial, clinging to the routine of command as if it could ward off the sickness. He had himself carried on a litter to the riverbank and boarded a boat to cross the Euphrates to the royal gardens on the west bank. seeking the cooler air away from the stifling city center. But the fever was a relentless enemy. It did not break. It grew. By the next day, the 19th, the pain had not subsided. Alexander bathed again, seeking relief in the water, but the heat was now in his blood. He met with Nearchus and listened to stories of the ocean voyage, trying to focus his mind on the horizon, on the future. "We sail in 3 days," he whispered. But his voice was weaker. The generals, Perdiccas and the others, began to exchange looks. They saw the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the glazing of his eyes. They moved the invasion date back by a day. Then another. The great machine of the empire was grinding to a halt, its gears stripped by a microscopic assassin. The question of what killed Alexander has puzzled historians and pathologists for 2 millennia. Was it malaria, contracted in the marshes? Was it typhoid fever? West Nile virus? Acute pancreatitis triggered by the massive alcohol intake? Or was it, as his mother Olympias would later insist, poison? The sudden onset of the pain, the spear blow to the back, suggests an acute internal catastrophe, perhaps a perforated ulcer or a necrotic pancreas. But to the men standing in the room, the medical diagnosis was irrelevant. What mattered was the metaphysical reality. The God King was mortal. By the 20th of Decius, the charade of normalcy began to crumble. Alexander could no longer leave his bed. The fever burned continuously, a continuous fever, as the royal journals described it. He was thirsty, horribly thirsty, consuming cup after cup of cold water that did nothing to quench the fire. The invasion of Arabia was indefinitely postponed. The soldiers in the camp outside the walls, sensing the paralysis in high command, began to gather in anxious knots. Rumors flew faster than arrows. "The king is dead," they whispered. "The king has been murdered. The king has ascended to Olympus." Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted from concern to conspiracy. The generals began to position themselves. They established a vigil, sleeping in the porticos outside the king's bedroom, ostensibly to be near him, but in reality to watch each other. Who had access to the bedside? Who was whispering in the dying king's ear? The air was thick with suspicion. Every cup of water, every sponge of vinegar brought to the king's lips was scrutinized. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar, designed to project the power of despots, had become a prison for a dying man. Alexander, in his lucid moments, must have felt the walls closing in. He had spent his life overcoming impossible odds, charging headlong into the enemy line, trusting his speed and his strength to save him. Now, there was no enemy to charge. There was only the heat, the thirst, and the faces of men who were already calculating the weight of his crown. The conqueror of the world was fighting a battle he could not win, alone in a room full of people. By the 21st of Decius, the pretense of a temporary indisposition had collapsed. The fever had changed character. It was no longer a wave that crested and broke, allowing moments of respite. It was a rising tide, a continuous fever that burned without pause. The royal journals, the day-to-day log of the court, record these dates with a clinical, terrifying brevity. They tell us that Alexander was moved from the stifling heat of the main palace complex to the hanging gardens, and then, in a desperate bid for cooler air, ferried across the Euphrates to the royal parks on the western bank. But the change of scenery brought no relief. The king was carrying the fire inside him. The medical knowledge of the ancient world, advanced as it was for its time, was helpless against a pathogen of this ferocity. The physicians, the best minds from Kos and Athens, hovered around the bed, their initial confidence evaporating into dread. They tried everything in their arsenal. They applied cool compresses soaked in vinegar to his burning forehead. They administered purgatives to cleanse the bile from his system. They likely attempted to bleed him, opening a vein to release the bad humors. But the king was already so weakened, his pulse so thready, that to draw blood was to draw away his life force. Alexander, even in this delirium, fought to remain Alexander. He was a man who had built his life on the twin pillars of military discipline and religious piety. He could no longer ride a horse, but he insisted on performing the daily sacrifices prescribed by the seers. It was a grotesque tableau of devotion. The king, too weak to stand, was carried on a litter to the altar. He could not hold the knife. He could barely lift his hand to pour the libation. He lay there, murmuring the prayers to the gods who seemed to have abandoned him, while the smoke of the incense mixed with the smell of sickness in the heavy air. He was bargaining with the heavens, offering the blood of animals in exchange for a few more years of breath. But the smoke rose and the fever remained. By the 23rd day, the king's condition had deteriorated into a crisis. He was breathing with difficulty, his lungs already compromised by that old arrow wound in India, struggling to oxygenate his blood. He was moved again, carried back across the river from the gardens to the fortified palace. This was not a medical decision. It was a security measure. The generals realized that if the king died in the open parks, the situation could spiral into immediate anarchy. He needed to be behind walls. He needed to be secured. Outside the sick room, the silence of the vigil was replaced by the noise of a crumbling empire. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar was vast, a labyrinth of corridors and courtyards, and now it echoed with the sound of panic. The army was camped on the plains outside the city, and the soldiers knew something was wrong. You cannot hide the illness of a sun god. The daily orders had stopped. The fleet exercises had been cancelled. The smoke of the sacrifices had ceased. The Macedonian veterans, the Silver Shields, and the Companions were men who had marched 20,000 miles for Alexander. They loved him with a fierce, possessive loyalty, but they also feared him. And more than that, they feared what would happen without him. They were far from home, surrounded by conquered nations that hated them. If Alexander died, they were stranded in the heart of Asia. Rumors began to tear through the ranks like wildfire. "He's already dead," men whispered around the campfires. "The generals are hiding the body to steal the treasury. He has been poisoned by the sons of Antipater." The tension between the infantry and the cavalry, the foot soldiers and the aristocratic officers, began to boil over. The common soldiers felt shut out. They saw the generals Perdiccas, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus coming and going from the palace with grim faces, wearing their armor as if expecting a battle. To the infantry, these men were vultures circling a dying lion. They suspected a coup. They began to crowd the gates of the palace, demanding to see their king. They did not want to see a general. They wanted to see the man who had led them through the Jedrosian desert. The palace guards, nervous and outnumbered, barred the doors with their spears, but the pressure of the mob was growing. The discipline that had conquered the world was fraying at the edges. Inside the royal apartments, the atmosphere was thick with conspiracy. The generals were indeed plotting, but they were also paralyzed. They were witnessing the impossible, the mortality of the invincible. They watched Alexander drift in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he would ask about the army. "Are the men ready?" he would rasp. "Is the fleet prepared?" The generals would lie to him. "Yes, king. Everything is ready." They soothed him like a child, knowing that the fleet would never sail, and the army was on the verge of mutiny. On the 24th of Decius, the fever reached a terrifying crescendo. Alexander sank into a deep coma, his body convulsing with tremors. The physicians stepped back, signaling the end of their utility. They wiped their hands and looked at the floor. Now, it was the time of the priests. The temples of Babylon were filled with smoke as the locals prayed to Marduk, and the Greeks prayed to Zeus, begging for a miracle. A group of high-ranking officers, desperate for guidance, went to the temple of Serapis, a god of healing and the underworld. They planned to ask the god a simple question: should we bring Alexander to the temple? They hoped that proximity to the divine might spark a recovery. But the oracle's answer was chillingly ambiguous. It is better for him to stay where he is. It was a death sentence disguised as advice. The god was saying that Alexander's relief would not come in this world. By the 25th day, the unthinkable happened. Alexander the Great, the man whose voice had commanded armies of 50,000 men, the man whose shout had rallied the line at Gaugamela and Issus, lost the power of speech. The fever had ravaged his throat and sapped his strength to the point where the muscles of his jaw and tongue would no longer obey his will. He lay on the bed, his eyes open, tracking the movement of the people in the room, but he was silent. This silence was more terrifying than any scream. For 12 years, Alexander's voice had been the engine of the empire. His speeches had quelled mutinies. His orders had toppled dynasties. Now, he was a prisoner in his own flesh. The generals leaned in close, putting their ears to his lips, hoping for a whisper, a name, a final command. Who was the heir? Who would take the ring? But there was only the ragged sound of his breathing. The power vacuum was instantaneous. Without the king's voice, there was no law. Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander, looked at Craterus, looked at Ptolemy. They realized that the glue holding the world together was dissolving before their eyes. In the absence of orders, ambition began to fill the void. They stopped looking at Alexander as a leader and began looking at him as an asset or an obstacle. The king was still breathing, but Alexander the Conqueror was already gone. Outside, the roar of the soldiers grew louder. They had heard the news of his silence. They believed he was dead, and that the silence was a lie constructed by the generals to buy time. They began to push against the bronze doors of the palace. The wood groaned. The guards looked back at the generals, panic in their eyes. The mob was coming. The barrier between the sacred chamber of the dying god and the profane chaos of the world was about to be breached. Alexander lay in the center of the storm, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, a silent observer of his own end. On the 25th of Decius, the walls of Protocol finally collapsed. The rumor that Alexander was already dead had whipped the army into a frenzy that the generals could no longer contain. The soldiers, the men who had bled with him at Issus, who had starved with him in the Gedrosian waste, did not want a revolution. They wanted the truth. They threatened to storm the royal apartments by force, swords drawn against their own officers. Terrified of a massacre within the palace, the generals capitulated. They ordered the bronze doors unbarred. What followed was one of the most singular and tragic processions in the history of the ancient world. The soldiers were ordered to file past the king's bed, unarmed and in silence. They entered the chamber dusty, smelling of the camp and the heat, and found their god reduced to a skeleton. Alexander lay on a simple cot, stripped of the trappings of power. He was unable to speak. His body was ravaged by 12 days of relentless fever. Yet, the historians Arrian and Plutarch record a detail that is almost unbearable in its humanity. As each soldier passed, Alexander struggled to raise his head. He greeted them with his eyes. He tried to nod or to lift a hand, acknowledging the men he had led to the edge of the earth. For hours, the only sound in the room was the shuffling of sandals on the mosaic floor and the stifled sobbing of hardened veterans. These were men who had butchered populations and burned cities without flinching, yet they wept openly at the sight of their commander's mortality. It was a long, agonizing farewell. Alexander watched his army dissolve into a line of grieving individuals, realizing perhaps for the first time that his power had always resided in them, not in him. By the time the last soldier left the room, the king was exhausted, his final reserve of strength spent on a silent goodbye. The room emptied, leaving only the generals, the companions, encircling the bed like statues. Perdiccas, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Python. The air was heavy with the smell of incense and impending death. They moved closer, their shadows falling over the king. They were desperate. The empire had no heir. Alexander's wife, Roxana, was pregnant, but the child was unborn and its sex unknown. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was mentally disabled, unfit to rule. The generals needed a name. They needed Alexander to speak. They leaned in, pressing him for a final testament. "To whom do you leave the kingdom?" they asked. The question hung in the stagnant air of the Babylonian twilight. Alexander's lips moved. He struggled to force air through his ruined throat. According to the legend that would define the next century of warfare, he whispered a single Greek word, krataisto, to the strongest. It was a curse disguised as a bequest. In that one word, Alexander ensured that his empire would not survive him. He did not name a successor. He named a gladiator match. He knew the nature of the men standing around him. He knew their ambition, their jealousy, their capacity for violence. By leaving the world to the strongest, he was inviting them to tear it apart to prove who was worthy. Some historians suggest he might have whispered kratero to Craterus, his loyal general currently marching back to Macedonia, but the difference was academic. The men in the room heard what they wanted to hear. They heard a permission slip for war. Then came the final gesture of authority. Alexander's hand, heavy and pale, fumbled at his side. He removed his signet ring, the heavy gold band engraved with the Lion of Macedonia, the seal that had stamped decrees governing millions of people from Greece to India. He did not speak again. He simply placed the ring into the palm of Perdiccas. It was a transfer of power, but it was ambiguous. Was Perdiccas the heir, or merely the regent? Was he the strongest, or just the man standing closest to the bed? Perdiccas closed his fist around the gold, feeling the warmth of the king's skin still on the metal. The other generals watched, their eyes locking onto the ring with predatory focus. The alliance that had held the empire together was now held by a single man, and the others were already calculating how to break him. The sun began to set over Babylon on the 28th of Dacius June, the 10th or 11th, 323 BC. The heat of the day finally broke, giving way to the oppressive, insect-filled night. In the royal chamber, the breathing of the king grew shallower. The continuous fever had burned away everything that was Alexander, leaving only a husk. The physicians checked his pulse, but there was no rhythm left. The chest rose, then fell, then did not rise again. The moment Alexander died, the room did not erupt into chaos. It fell into a terrifying, absolute silence. The most energetic force in human history had been extinguished. For a decade, the world had spun around the axis of this one man's will. Now, the axis had snapped. The generals stood frozen, looking at the corpse, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the void that had just opened. The lamps flickered in the draft. Outside, the wailing of the soldiers began to rise again, a raw, animal sound of collective grief. But inside the room, the grief was already mutating into something colder. Perdiccas looked at the ring in his hand. Ptolemy looked at the door. Seleucus looked at the floor. They were no longer subordinates. They were rivals. The body of the king was not even cold before the calculations began. Who would control the army? Who would control the treasury? Who would control the body? In the Persian tradition, the sacred fires in the temples were extinguished when a king died. As the news spread through the city, Babylon went dark. The markets emptied. The people barred their doors, terrified of the looting and violence that always accompanied a transition of power. The king of the world was dead at 32. He had conquered the earth, but he had failed to conquer time. He lay on his bed, a man of average height with golden hair and different colored eyes, looking small and human in the vastness of the palace he had claimed. The ring was gone. The voice was silenced. And in the shadows of the room, the wars of the Diadochi, the wars of the successors, were already beginning to take shape. For 32 years, the body of Alexander had been the most valuable object on earth. It was the vessel of a god, the instrument of conquest, the center of the world's attention. But in the hours following his death, a strange and terrible thing happened. The king was forgotten. As the generals stormed out of the death chamber to argue over the division of the empire, and the soldiers rioted in the courtyards, Alexander was left alone. The man who had been attended by thousands of servants was now a solitary corpse, cooling rapidly in the stifling heat of the Babylonian summer. History records a grotesque interregnum. While the palace exploded into a political crisis, the body lay on the bed, untended. The ancient historians Plutarch and Cordelius Rufus tell us that for several days and nights, the king lay ignored. The heat in Babylon in June is merciless, often reaching 45 degrees Celsius. In such conditions, the biological reality of death usually asserts itself with horrifying speed. Yet, the sources claim that Alexander remained pristine, fresh and lively, as if he were merely sleeping. This was likely the first piece of propaganda of the new era, a miracle fabricated by the successors to prove his divinity. In reality, the delay was a dangerous gamble with nature. The generals were so consumed by their greed that they risked the decomposition of the very symbol of their legitimacy. Finally, the paralysis broke. The order was given to preserve the king, but this was not to be a Greek funeral with a pyre and a swift ascent to Olympus in smoke. The generals wanted the body to remain. It was a totem of power, a talisman that conferred the right to rule. Embalmers were summoned, likely Egyptians or Chaldeans skilled in the arts of mummification. They did not wrap him in linen immediately. Instead, they employed a method reserved for the highest nobility of the East. They placed Alexander in a coffin of beaten gold and filled it with white honey. The honey was a masterstroke of preservation. Its high sugar content and acidity created a sterile environment, sealing the body away from the air and the bacteria of the marshlands. It was a sweet amber womb designed to halt the passage of time. As the golden liquid rose over his chest, his face, and finally his eyes, Alexander was transformed from a man into an artifact. He became a statue suspended in gold, immune to the rot that was already spreading through his empire. But while the honey preserved the king's shell, the poison of ambition was dissolving his legacy just a few rooms away. The conflict that erupted in the palace was not merely a dispute over leadership. It was a class war. On one side stood the cavalry, the aristocratic companions led by Perdiccas. They were the nobility, the men who had feasted with Alexander, the men who wore the gold rings. They proposed a regency, waiting for the birth of Roxana's child. It was a plan that concentrated power in their own hands. On the other side stood the infantry, the phalanx, the rough, dusty men who held the sarissas. They were led by Meleager, a bitter and populist general who despised the arrogance of the cavalry. The infantry wanted a king now. They did not want to wait for a half-Persian baby to be born. They wanted a Macedonian bloodline they could see and touch. They found their puppet in the shadows of the palace. Aregeus, Alexander's half-brother, was a man who had lived his entire life in fear. Mentally disabled, perhaps due to a poisoning attempt by Olympias in his childhood, or perhaps simply born simple, he had been kept as a harmless pet of the court. The infantry dragged him out of his chambers, threw a royal cloak over his shoulders, and proclaimed him King Philip III. It was a farce. The man who now wore the diadem of the conqueror cowered before the soldiers who hailed him. But to Meleager, he was perfect. A weak king meant a strong general. The standoff brought the greatest army in the world to the brink of civil war. The cavalry rode out of the city and blockaded the walls, cutting off the food supply. The infantry, trapped inside with their puppet king, began to starve. The heat, the hunger, and the fear broke their resolve. A compromise was reached, the partition of Babylon. It was decided that Aridaeus would be king, but if Roxana bore a son, he would be joint king. Perdiccas would be the regent. It seemed like a settlement, a moment of unity to honor the dead conqueror. But Perdiccas was a student of Alexander. He knew that power is not shared, it is seized. He arranged a reconciliation ceremony, a traditional Macedonian ritual of purification called a lustration, to cleanse the army of the bad blood caused by the mutiny. The entire army, cavalry, and infantry assembled on the plain outside the city walls. They marched between the severed halves of a sacrificed dog, a rite meant to bind them in loyalty, but it was a trap. As the infantry stood in formation, believing they were there to pray and renew their oaths, Perdiccas made his move. He had identified the ringleaders of the mutiny, the men who had supported Meleager. At a signal, the cavalry surrounded the phalanx. But the true horror came from the beasts. Perdiccas ordered the war elephants' massive armored tanks brought from India to advance. The elephants did not charge the whole line. They were directed at specific men. In front of the entire army, and in front of the terrified puppet King Aridaeus, 300 of Meleager's supporters were singled out. They were cast beneath the feet of the elephants. The great beasts trampled them to death, crushing skulls and chests into the Babylonian dust. It was a spectacle of supreme brutality. The infantry watched in frozen silence, realizing that their spears were useless against the combined weight of the cavalry and the elephants. Meleager, seeing his power base turned into a red paste on the parade ground, fled to a temple for sanctuary. It did not save him. Perdiccas had him murdered in the holy precinct shortly after. This was the funeral game of Alexander the Great. Before he was even in his tomb, his army had turned on itself. The purification had been a massacre. The body of the king lay safe in its bed of honey, silent and perfect, while outside, the screams of his soldiers echoed off the walls of the city he had planned to make the capital of the world. Perdiccas had secured the ring, the regent's title, and the custody of the kings. He had won the first round of the game. But he had taught his rivals, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Seleucus, a lesson they would never forget. There were no rules anymore. The lion was dead, and the era of the wolves had begun. It took 2 years for the shock of Alexander's death to solidify into a monument. While the generals fought their proxy wars and the empire began to fray at the seams, the body of the king remained in Babylon, the silent center of a hurricane. Perdiccas the regent had ordered a funeral carriage to be constructed that would be worthy of a god. The result was not merely a hearse. It was a mobile wonder of the world. Ancient sources describe a vehicle of staggering opulence, a golden temple on wheels that cost nearly 200 talents of silver. It had a vaulted roof covered in gold scales set with jewels, supported by Ionic columns. It was adorned with paintings depicting the king's life, Alexander with his scepter, Alexander with his army, Alexander with the gods. It was drawn by 64 mules, each crowned with a gilded bell, so that the sound of the king's approach would be heard for miles before he was seen. The destination of this golden catafalque was a matter of supreme political importance. Perdiccas, seeking to legitimize his own authority and perhaps to eventually claim the throne, ordered the body to be returned to Macedonia. He intended for Alexander to be buried in the ancient royal necropolis at Aegina, alongside his father Philip and the ancestors of the Argead dynasty. To possess the body was to possess the mandate of heaven. If Perdiccas could bury the king, he would be the king's true successor. But there was another player in the game who understood the power of symbols far better than the regent. Ptolemy, the general who had secured the governorship of Egypt, knew of a prophecy attributed to the seer Aristander that the land which held Alexander's body would never be conquered and would know eternal prosperity. Ptolemy did not want the body in the cold earth of Macedonia, under the control of Perdiccas. He wanted it in Egypt, the land where Alexander had been declared the son of Ammon. He wanted the king to become the eternal guardian of his new dynasty. In late 321 BC, the great procession finally left Babylon. It was a spectacle that drew thousands of spectators from the villages along the route, a glittering river of gold moving west. But as the cortege reached Syria, it was met not by a welcoming committee, but by an army. Ptolemy had marched out from Egypt with a massive force. He did not attack the funeral train. He simply escorted it. In a masterstroke of diplomatic theft, he convinced the commander of the convoy that Alexander's true wish had been to be buried in the Siwa oasis, near his divine father. The carriage turned south. The king was not going home to the mountains of the north. He was going to the sands of the Nile. When Perdiccas heard that the body had been hijacked, he was apoplectic. He launched a massive invasion of Egypt to reclaim the corpse and punish the thief. but the Nile was a cruel barrier. Perdiccas failed to cross the river, losing 2,000 men to the crocodiles and the current. His own officers, disgusted by his failure and weary of his arrogance, marched into his tent that night and stabbed him to death. The regent was dead. The ring he had taken from Alexander's dying hand was passed on, but the unity of the empire died with him. The body remained with Ptolemy. With the death of Perdiccas, the last restraint was removed. The funeral games began in earnest. For the next 40 years, the world was consumed by the wars of the Diadochi, the successors. The generals who had once feasted together in Babylon now slaughtered each other on the battlefields of Asia, Europe, and Africa. Antigonus the one-eyed, Seleucus the victor, Lysimachus, Cassander, they carved the empire into personal fiefdoms. They took the title of king one by one, erasing the fiction of a unified state. The map of the world, which Alexander had erased borders to create, was redrawn in blood. The greatest casualties of this war were not the soldiers, but the family Alexander had left behind. The destruction of the house of Argead was total and merciless. Olympias, the terrifying mother who had birthed the conqueror, was besieged and stoned to death by the relatives of her victims. Roxana, the beautiful Bactrian wife Alexander had loved, and her young son, Alexander IV, the rightful heir to the world, were imprisoned in the fortress of Amphipolis. They were not allowed to live. Cassander, the son of Antipater, a man who hated Alexander with a pathological intensity, ordered them poisoned. The boy was only 13. He was buried in secret, his name erased, his potential unfulfilled. The bloodline of Achilles and Heracles, which Alexander had been so proud of, was extinguished in a dark cell, ended by the hands of his own countrymen. And what of the king himself? Ptolemy did not take the body to the Siwa oasis. He kept it in Memphis for a time, before moving it to his new capital, Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded, laid out in the shape of a chlamys cloak. There, a magnificent tomb was built, the Soma or Sima, located at the crossroads of the city's main avenues. Alexander lay in his golden coffin, the centerpiece of the Ptolemaic dynasty. For centuries, he was the pilgrimage site of the ancient world. The great men of Rome came to pay their respects and to measure themselves against him. Julius Caesar visited and wept, ashamed that at Alexander's age he had achieved so little. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, came to the tomb after conquering Egypt. He gazed upon the mummy, which was by then 3 centuries old. The historian Suetonius records that Augustus ordered the glass sarcophagus opened. He placed a golden crown on the king's head and strewed flowers over the body. When asked if he wanted to see the bodies of the Ptolemies as well, Augustus sneered, "I came to see a king, not a row of corpses." In his eagerness to touch the past, Augustus reportedly accidentally broke off a piece of Alexander's nose, a final physical indignity for the man who had sought perfection. But time is the ultimate conqueror. As the centuries wore on, the tomb began to suffer. The golden sarcophagus was melted down by a later bankrupt Ptolemy and replaced with glass or crystal. The city of Alexandria was ravaged by tsunamis, earthquakes, and riots. The location of the tomb, once the center of the city, was lost in the chaos of the rising Christian and then Islamic worlds. By the 4th century AD, the location was a mystery. St. John Chrysostom could write, "Where is the tomb of Alexander? Show it to me." No one could. Today, the city of Alexandria still stands, a bustling metropolis on the Mediterranean, but the king is gone. He lies somewhere beneath the modern streets, perhaps under the mosque of Nebi Daniel, or perhaps he was washed into the sea long ago. The man who wanted to be a god, who wanted to live forever in the minds of men, achieved his immortality, but at a terrible price. His empire shattered, his family murdered, his tomb vanished. Alexander's dying wish was to leave his world to the strongest. In the end, the strongest force was not Perdiccas or Ptolemy or Rome. It was entropy. The silence that fell over the bedroom in Babylon has spread to cover his resting place. We are left with the legends, the maps, and the echo of a young man's ambition that once burned bright enough to set the world on fire. It remains the measure against which all other conquerors are judged, a ghost haunting the history of the West and the East alike. The funeral games are over, but the shadow of the king still stretches across the earth. Narrator pauses. The image of the fractured map lingers, then slowly fades to absolute black, leaving only silence.